My name is Irene Wegner, and I'm representing the Fairhope Library this morning. I'm interviewing Jeremy Hahn on August 4th, 2021. This interview is being conducted for the Fairhope Library's Veterans Oral History Collection. So, Jeremy, welcome. We're glad you're here. Can you tell us your full name and date of birth, branch of service, all that kind of stuff, and then we'll get going.
Okay. So, full name, Jeremy Robert Hahn. Robert was both my grandparents, so that's where I came from. August 12th, 1972. So one more year to 50. I was born actually on the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs. My dad was teaching at the Air Force Academy back in 1972 when I was born. So.
And your father was in the Air Force, and so you went to a lot of different places with that?
Yeah, so I remember growing up my younger years in California. He's out in Vandenberg, and I think Los Angeles had an air base there too. But I was young, so I don't remember a whole lot about it. I remember he's an engineer. He was on the project that developed the GPS.
Oh.
Yeah, so I remember going out as a kid, and we were all standing around this little hockey puck thing, and they're waiting for it to do something, and I just wanted to run around and play and catch lizards, but so.
Sounds like a wonderful childhood. That sounds great.
Yeah. So we lived there until I was 11, and then we moved to the East Coast, and then we ended up in Ohio for a few years, and then my father actually passed away from a brain tumor, and so we moved to New Mexico, and that's where I went to high school and college and joined the Army from there.
So your father was Air Force, but you joined the Army. Why was that?
I don't know. I was more of an outside person, I think. I just like to be in the field, and Air Force was really, I remember him, and it might have just been because he was an engineer, but he had pretty much like a kind of a 9-to-5 type of job and office job, and I just, after being in college, and because I got my degree in biochemistry, and I didn't want to be in a lab, I wanted to do something, a little bit more exciting, so
out in the field. Were you able to use that in the Army?
Not at all. It helped me get my commission, but other than that, no.
Okay, so you said you were enlisted first.
So yeah, I enlisted first back then, and they still have it now. It's called loan repayment, and to get my college paid off. So I did that initial enlistment, and then applied for, it's called Officer Candidate School.
OCS.
OCS, yeah, and got my commission through there.
Okay, and so where were you when all that happened?
So there, I was at Fort Gordon, Georgia, when I applied and got accepted, and then the school is right down the road at Fort Benning, Georgia, and so it was 14 weeks there, and so I graduated in April of 2001, I believe. And then went to officer basic school. So you get commissioned, you're a lieutenant, but then you have to go out to your next schooling, which, whatever you are. So I was an ordnance officer. So that was that.
What did that entail?
So ordnance, most people think of it as munitions, and that's what it used to be, but it's more now maintenance. So it's about 10% ordnance and then about 90% maintenance. At least it was when I was in.
Maintenance of what?
Just about everything. So everything needs to be maintained in the Army. Soldiers enlisted, they have different MOSs, and so some may work on trucks, some may work on helicopters and everything in between, radios, whatever. And then as a young lieutenant, you just kind of manage depending on what unit you're assigned to.
Now, we were talking before we started the interview, and we said that it was hard to get parts. So if you were managing this and it's not wartime, what did you do about all that?
So luckily, when I was enlisted, I was well above my pay grade to have to fight to get resources. I just remember, it was, listening to leadership talk about it's hard to get parts, and and when you got parts, if something happened to it, they held that person accountable, which they should have done, which they should do. If it's egregious, or I forgot the term they used, negligence or gross negligence. But then just after the wars kicked off, the floodgates kind of opened up, and then while you're overseas, there's plenty of money, and it didn't seem like there was that much enforcement of things getting broken or lost. Not that people were just careless, but it just there was plenty to go around. But then stateside, while you were training, that's where it was hard to get parts sometimes. So we were having to go to sister units and ask for sometimes engines for a tank or for some kind of vehicle or just a whole piece of equipment. Generators are a big thing too. Trying to get enough generators to actually go to the field or to NTC, which is the National Training Center out at Fort Irwin, California, just to train. So,
but when the war broke out, you said there was plenty. So what were you doing when the war broke out?
So when the war actually broke out, I was actually.
You want to tell what war you were talking about?
So the Iraq War. So back in 2003, when we actually went into Iraq for the first time, or second time. First time, a lot of people don't count because you just kind of let them go after a certain distance that they retreated back into their country. But this time, we actually went in to Iraq and took the capital.
And you were part of that?
Yeah. So back in 2003, I was in a unit that was part of that initial push into Iraq.
So you've been in a number of places, but going in as part of a war group like that, how was that, leaving everything at home, and how did that all?
It was difficult. I think a lot of people had the mindset from the 90s, the first time we were in that conflict, and it was quick. Mm-hmm. So that's what a lot of myself included, a lot of soldiers, and myself included, thought was going to happen, and didn't happen that way. We were there years later. So that first deployment was very tough because we didn't know what to expect, and
did you have people at home too?
I did, wife and two daughters, so it was tough leaving them and not knowing when I was coming back, and then I kept getting pushed down the road, and eventually we did an entire year and without any kind of break, because after that first year, usually you get what's called an R&R. Yeah. So sometime within that deployment, you would get to go home, or the Army would basically pay you to go wherever you wanted for vacations.
Right.
But most people went home. So we didn't get that first deployment. So it was just 12 months straight. Not seeing your family, and so that was tough. But.
Yeah. When you were there, did you interact with the Iraqis, or were you mainly on a base?
So my first deployment, we really didn't have bases yet. They were getting established. By the end of my deployment, we were on what was called LSA Anaconda, which is a little bit north of Baghdad. And I think it was one of the last bases they shut down because it was a very large logistics hub for the entire country. So for my last 3 months, I think we were there. But up to then, we were pretty much, the first couple months we were living, just wherever we decided to stop for the day until we got to outside of Baghdad. So we didn't
was
interact.
That like camping, or was camping out, or was that
kind of? It took almost 30 days before I got my first shower, so it was really rough camping. It got very built up after that. I mean, I'm sure you've heard other stories of some of these big bases that people lived on, and they almost had like a place where they lived, a shower, and everything else. So we didn't really have that, at least the first half of that first deployment. But we didn't really interact with the Iraqis too much. There was a little bit, we just kind of maybe trade money, give them $1 and they give you a dinar, and just.
Did you learn any languages or
no,
customs or?
A little bit of custom stuff. So my second deployment to Iraq, I was actually an advisor to a lieutenant colonel in the Iraqi army, and so there I did get a lot of immersion into their culture.
What was that like?
It was an experience. Trying to get them to do stuff was very, very difficult. They always would say they were going to do something, and then they'd always say tomorrow, which meant they're not going to do it. So just trying to, and I was a logistics advisor because he was the brigade S4, which is S4 is the logistics for a unit. And they didn't have a whole lot of trust amongst themselves. So he tried to do everything himself, and he kind of kept everything, all the resources, that he was signed for, because if he'd lose them, he was the one that was going to be in trouble. But I remember we were going out, walking around, and he had these big mill vans, which is just a big container that was full of clothes, like uniforms that he wasn't giving out to the young soldiers. And so I'd ask him, hey, why aren't you giving these out? Because there were soldiers that were running around that didn't have any shoes, boots or anything on, or
wow.
ripped up, uniforms. And he's like, oh, if I just give it to them, they sell it. Or so there just wasn't a whole lot of trust. And so it was, the Army in general did that, and the Marine Corps did it as well. Did a lot of that advisory stuff for years, trying to break some of those old habits. But you had Sunnis, which, and you had Shia, and then you did have like some Christians in there, and then you had Kurds, which were, most of them were Sunni as well, but they were different in the north, but they were different ethnic.
Yeah.
And my advisor, he was a Kurd, so he was a Sunni Kurd.
Oh, made it hard.
Yeah, and so the unit he was in was a Sunni, mostly they were Sunni. And so they didn't really like him too much.
That added to it, yeah.
Yeah, and there were very few Shia Muslims in that organization. And we started out in Fallujah, but then we ended up going all the way down to, it was near the southern border, near Kuwait, Basra. And so we were down there, and that's a very heavy Shia area. So when they kind of heard that this brigade, Sunni brigade, was coming down there, we were expecting a lot of conflict coming down there, and really wasn't a whole lot, surprisingly, because the reason we went down there is the army that was down there was a Shia brigade, but they basically defected and gave all their equipment to Muqtada al-Sadr's militia, which I can't remember who they were called now. I think Jaysh al-Mahdi. And so we were expecting to go down there and to fight, but went down there, and they cleared the entire town without a single shot. So it was interesting, yeah. But
so the prejudice and the interaction between these different groups kind of hindered any sort of progress you would make.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
To some extent. And it was different how, like the brigade commander for that organization, you got that position based off of, you would buy it, basically. Oh. There's some merit-based stuff to earning your rank, but to actually be a command position was kind of, you bought that. Because there was an understanding that with that came your ability to kind of extort some money with the local populace. So we did see some of that. But he was a
Kurd.
Well, the brigade commander was a Sunni.
Okay.
So my counterpart, who was the brigade S4, which is one of his staff officers, was a Kurd.
So he wouldn't have too much input or too much importance in the rank because he was totally different,
right.
But it's kind of isolated from the rest. And maybe.
Correct. Yeah, and that's kind of what he was dealing with, is in that position, trying to talk. Because I'd ask him, have you talked to your brigade commander, your brigade XO? You don't always just go right to your commander, because he has an XO that's supposed to filter out some things, but they won't listen to me, and so it was just kind of hard to see that, because they did kind of minimize them. So I'd always go, my boss was the advisor to the brigade commander. Yeah. So, I'd always try to go through him as well to say, hey, can you talk to the brigade commander about, whatever.
How did that all work out then?
So slowly over time, it seemed to get better. By the time we left, we all had a pretty good relationship. There was still some friction with the different, religions, different sects there, but and I always kind of wondered, how that was after we left, if it continued to get better or if it kind of went back to the old ways.
Were you always with the different soldiers, or did you, for instance, did they go to their homes, and were you invited in to eat with them or anything like that happen? Or?
A few times. We didn't go to their homes. They would have, I think it was called Jundi. That was their R&R, and they would get that. I think it seemed like it was quite a bit. It seemed like we'd have to, before they could leave, they were actually had to be, frisked down to make sure that they weren't stealing stuff or taking stuff back home to sell it. But they did that totally separate. I never met my counterparts' family because they were up in the north.
That's true, yeah.
And most of them were, except for the brigade commander. He moved his family down when we went from Fallujah down to Basra. But most of them no. Where we would go in is like the clerics around the town, the ones that had like all the power or whatever, and try to work things out with them. And then we'd go in and we'd sit down with them and usually have lamb and rice was usually the main meal.
And they did it. It was good.
It was actually pretty good, yeah. And we did have dinner almost every night with our Iraqi officers. Sometimes we'd eat our MREs, which wasn't nearly as good as their food, because they actually ate pretty well. I think the soldiers not so much, but the officers ate really well. But I remember, the first time we actually sat down, we all just kind of sat around in a circle, and there was this, lamb. I think it was lamb in the middle with a bunch of rice, and so my counterpart grabbed a big piece off this animal and just kind of with his hands and stuck it in front of me and told me to eat. And I just remember him grabbing it, and there was like grease and stuff coming through the fingers, and like, I don't know if I want to eat this, but that's really good.
Did they use bread to scoop it up, or did they use utensils?
They used mostly their hands, so they grab it like this, and then they kind of use their thumb to kind of push it out. But yeah, sometimes they'd use bread, but it was mostly their hands that they used.
Now, what did they drink?
A lot of tea, mostly tea with a lot of sugar, and it was usually like in like a little tiny glass, and they'd fill about halfway with sugar.
And it was warm?
Yeah, it was warm. Yeah, which is interesting when it's 100 plus outside, drinking hot tea, but it was good. But it's because it was basically just liquid sugar.
When you were off duty, what did you guys do there?
In Iraq, so that first deployment, it was, the theater wasn't built up yet, so we didn't have computers, so it was basically stand in line for an hour to use the phone for 10 minutes, so a lot of that, a lot of just planning for the next day, if you did get a little downtime, maybe watch a movie.
Did you get any care packages? What were in them?
We did get a ton of those. I always asked for those oatmeal cream pies, so I got inundated with those. I still don't eat them because I had so many when I was there. Plus, if you package it with because we get a lot of like baby wipes and soap and stuff, but there's something that it would bleed through into the oatmeal cream pies, so when you bite into it, it almost tastes like soap. So I don't eat those anymore because of that. But yeah, we did get tons of books. Some movies, a lot of letters from schools that would,
Did you get any liquor? Because
no,
not at all.
None of that. No,
because I understand you can put it in a loaf of bread and send it over there.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
I've heard stories of people doing it.
Yeah.
And some got caught, some didn't. I know there were, contrary to what a lot of people think, there was actually a distillery in Iraq where they actually brewed beer, and actually distilled liquor, and people would try to sell you stuff. So you had these long convoys coming into the base, and as you're approaching the base, they'd come up and try to sell you different movies, bootleg movies and bottles of whiskey and stuff like that.
What about jewelry and things like that too?
Jewelry, I don't remember buying too much jewelry in Iraq. In Afghanistan,
Watches.
It was, they would try to sell you just about anything they could, but it wasn't really, my first deployment wasn't set up yet. The Iraqis hadn't really figured out, that we're a prime target for selling stuff to. And then in my second deployment, we were embedded with the Iraqi army, so I didn't really see any of that either. Not until Afghanistan did I really go on the base, and they would actually give the Iraqi or the Afghanis like parts of the base to actually sell. They call them bazaars, and I think they did that in Iraq as well.
Yeah.
Bazaars to sell.
So you were in Iraq, and then you came home, yes?
Yep.
And for how long?
So I was home after that first deployment, I was home for a while. That's when I went to Fort Carson. I was assigned to a ACRC brigade, is active component, reserve component. It was, again, kind of like an advisory thing. We're there just to kind of help the reserve components come up with like a training plan for their, readiness.
So what part of your experiences that you've already had could you use to share with the people who are in reserve or haven't been over there?
So the funny thing about that job is that's what ACRC is designed to be, but what it turned into was we were just training reserve component and some National Guard component to deploy. So we had to come up with a training plan for them to actually deploy, not just your, just normal readiness job. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's typically in a unit you go through a cycle because you have soldiers coming in and out constantly. So it goes through a cycle and it repeats. So you do your basic stuff, they call it soldier level tasks, so they kind of learn their basic stuff, and then it continues to build until you do like an organizational wide exercise, and that's your certification that you're ready. Well, the reserves do it, but it takes a little bit longer because they're not, coming to work every day.
Yeah.
So that's really what ACRC was designed to do, to kind of help them come up with that plan to get them ready for that culminating exercise that says, yeah, I'm whatever, an engineer unit or some type of logistics or signal unit, that they're trained and ready. That didn't really apply going overseas always because it was you weren't always doing a set mission with what you were training for back home. So we were there just to help them get ready to deploy and give them the basic, convoy type procedure stuff. But
you had extra information because you were already a veteran of all that.
Correct.
So you had maybe some experiences you could share with them. So don't do this, don't buy that from that.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, some custom stuff. I mean, so they don't point. You point with your whole hand, not a finger.
Okay.
Over there. You don't.
No. So you don't use your left hand?
You don't use anything with your left hand because that's the hand they use to kind of clean themselves.
You eat with your right hand then?
Yes, everything's done with your right hand.
Wow. What if you're a left-hander? That's difficult.
Yeah, you got to figure that out. Ambidextrous, I guess, but you're not supposed to show the bottoms of your feet because it's dirty. There's a lot of different things, especially when it came to women. I mean, you don't talk to a woman without a man present. Usually a man that's part of her family, or so. Trying to learn those things, and so that they don't go over there and make the same mistakes we'd made the first time going there.
Right. That's what I was getting at. Yeah. So, were there any stories about that you want to share? Or?
Luckily, not too much. We only had one incident. You heard a lot of instances of abuse or whatever going on, and luckily I didn't see any of that while I was there. There was one where we had there was kids that were throwing rocks at some of the soldiers, and the soldiers threw a rock back and hit a kid in the head and split his head open, and so we had to send some medics over and stitch his head up, and that soldier obviously got in trouble, but luckily nothing that really escalated to an actual skirmish, if you will.
Yeah.
So.
Now, you went to Afghanistan which is finally being closed.
Mm-hmm.
And how long were you? Where were you there, and how long were you there?
So I was there the first time from
Oh my gosh.
August of 10 to basically August of 2011. So it was always a year, and then you get a couple weeks off in the middle sometime to come home. So that one I was actually a company commander, so I was in command of an organization.
Okay.
When I went over to Afghanistan.
So you had been promoted.
Yeah. So yeah, my first deployment, I was a lieutenant. I was a platoon leader, and that was OIF-1, the one where we didn't have much, going in. The second one, I was still a captain. I got promoted to captain. And that was the one where I was doing the advisory role.
Yeah.
In Iraq, and then I received my company, so command still as a captain, and we went over to Afghanistan in 2010. And then my last deployment, I was a major, and I was the brigade ops officer
Okay.
for my last deployment in 2013.
So was that more administrative, or were you in the field?
So the command, I was in the field, and I loved it. I'd say that one and probably the advisory role were probably my two favorite deployments. As a commander, you have a lot of leeway with what you want to do as long as you're getting your mission accomplished. So I was going out on convoys a lot just to, just to get out of the base and, be with the soldiers, so that they don't think that as officers we just sit back behind a desk and they go out and take all the risks. And so I'd always make sure I'd go out on at least one convoy a week. So I was out quite a bit, and then I had soldiers all over. I was a maintenance company commander, so we supported the special forces guys to some extent. So we had what we called them MSTs, or mission support teams, or maintenance support teams. It was just a few soldiers that would be out on.
How is that different from Iraq then?
As far as the support of it?
Well, the support, and also just the whole situation. Was it more difficult, or was it more scary? Or
I didn't think it was more scary. Because we were kind of on the western side of Afghanistan, and so it wasn't. We were on the border, almost near the border of Iran, but there was really, we go through Kandahar a lot, and that would kind of get hairy sometimes. But there's a couple convoys that we had that got hit, but it wasn't. I never was really scared there, like I probably was in being embedded with the Iraqi army, because you never know. You hear of instances where they turn on their mentors or counterparts. So it was nice having that feeling that I had all the assets that I had in my organization to defend off anything if we were to come into contact with anybody. But Afghanistan as a whole, it's kind of hard to say. I didn't really have much confidence that our presence there was helping them much, unfortunately. Iraq, I had a lot of hope, because you could, maybe it was because we were embedded with them, and I could kind of see, that they were slowly getting things, and they were slowly being able to police themselves and, take security or maintain security of their country to some extent. And then we pulled out, and then ISIS came in. But up until that point, it seemed like they were on the right track. Afghanistan, they just never seemed to get that. They just, for whatever reason, I think it's just because they're so tribal there, and there's some tribalism in Iraq too, but it just seemed like Afghanistan, I don't know if they didn't want it, or they were just too scared, or the tribes came in, but they just never seemed to get that security.
So your view on our pulling out is what?
In Afghanistan, it's kind of mixed. It's going to go right back to the way it was after, before 9/11. But
20 years. Yeah.
But at the same time, if there's not enough people in that country that want it, want security and want peace, or they're willing to fight for it, then I don't know that we can't be there forever to take care of them.
Do they get enough communication to know what's going on?
No, they don't. I mean, there's a problem in Iraq too, but Iraq, before Saddam Hussein came along, was a very prosperous country. Yes. It had universities and doctors, and it was, and a lot of that is still, it's a couple generations removed, but it's still possible to bring that back in. Afghanistan, they just seem like they're just stuck in biblical times almost. Yeah. It's just, they just couldn't get it going, and at what point do you decide enough's enough and time to come home?
But then you went to Colombia?
So I went to Colombia actually before all this. That was my only deployment as an enlisted person. So I was a young, I can't remember if I was E5 then or if I was still E4. Maybe, I can't remember. It was either a young corporal or a sergeant.
And the purpose for being there, because like I said earlier, about Colombia, drugs.
Yeah, so it was.
And so what did you do? I mean, how did that work?
So I was the NCOIC of a system that basically provided the signal to the satellite, if you will. And it was, a lot of it was classified and still is, but it was, we were basically there to listen in on the drug cartels and try to find out where they were operating at, and then interdict and take their stuff from them.
That kind of reminds me of your father developing the GPS, and then you're using this type of systems that he helped develop, I would think, in a way that there's some
I use the GPS to really take hold until like my deployments, like in Iraq.
Yeah.
So we actually had GPS to actually kind of guide ourselves. That one in Colombia was more of, we had groups listening, and then we had, our job was basically just to open up this pipe so that we can pipe that information back and forth, because we obviously couldn't use the local infrastructure there to send anything secure.
So you've had a lot of experience overseas and with all sorts of wartime service type stuff, but coming back, how was it always when you had to come back? When you wanted to come back?
Yeah, so coming back was always something you look forward to, and I think every soldier had their
this life is
different, had their different countdown, different way to kind of count the days down until you get to go home. But it's always an experience. You come back, your kids are a year older, and wife's a little bit more independent, and
yes.
So you got to kind of walk with a fine line. You don't want to come in and just kind of go back to how things were when you left, because they've had a year to, grow and figure out their own way of doing things. So trying to kind of figure that out was sometimes a little difficult at first, but it was always, you're coming home and it's family, you figure it out. But I think the biggest thing is, over there, everything's free. You walk in, unless you go to the, to buy stuff at the PX or whatever, a little exchange they had there. But you go into a dining facility and you just take water out. And so I remember one time going into a gas station and I just grabbed the water and I was walking out and I caught myself. I was like, oh, wait, I got to pay for this. So going back and then having to pay for it. But
getting into civilian life is a little different.
Yeah, or driving an actual car again instead of these big, huge trucks. Or as an officer, I hardly ever drove. Somebody else was always driving for me. But so
getting
driving
back,
again was
Is it like getting back on a bicycle, like they say? Or was it?
Yeah. You're a lot lower to the ground. It seemed like and actually having to stop at lights, because there we didn't stop.
Turn signals.
We turn signals and
Wow.
So not having to wear all that stuff, to get into your vehicle, and all the headgear and all that stuff.
Yeah,
and
right.
So, yeah.
A little bit different there, yeah. Was there anybody there that was a friendship you formed, or that you continued to use?
I've kind of lost track with a lot of them, sadly.
Do you go to any of the veteran things?
We don't really have, I don't know, maybe I haven't been far enough removed from that yet that there's really been any. Like on that advisory role, I still maintain contact with a lot of the soldiers I was with.
Yeah.
And I do know my boss from that mission, he still is in contact with that brigade commander from time to time. I haven't talked to him in a couple of years, but last I heard is he was still talking to him from time to time. Our interpreters, all of them except for one, are here in the U.S. now. One of them joined the Army. He's a truck driver in the Army. So.
Huh. How was that? I mean, that's the interpreters that are coming over now and the issues that they have. Was that a problem when you were there?
No. So, listen to some of the stories that they would tell. It was pretty scary. They'd sit on a bus next to somebody that would basically say, "Yeah, if I ever find somebody that's working with Americans, I'll kill them or whatever." And so it's, it was. I know it had been scary for those guys, and they really didn't like to go home because they didn't want people asking them questions like, "Where have you been?" or
Right.
So it was, but there was no issues getting them over to the U.S. I mean, a lot of them need recommendations, or at least
and their
reference.
families too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, immediate family. So they really wouldn't be able to bring their parents over. Which one of them is really just trying to get his mom, and I think he might have actually got his mom eventually. He couldn't at first. It was just him, and he wasn't married, so it was just him. But there was one of them that, he had a wife, and he was able to get them over with. Interesting to hear, all these interpreters in Afghanistan, that they're talking about, we got to take care of them. And we need to, because they took a big risk helping us out. But it's weird how they haven't thought that through until now. I don't understand. Because, our interpreters, I can't remember how long they had to work with us. I think it was either a year, maybe 2 years before they can apply for, citizenship or visa or whatever it was to come over to the U.S. So I'm not sure why we knew we were going to pull out, why they weren't working that before now, but it's
different
so
process.
I know I can imagine there's probably a place in Afghanistan, or maybe right outside Afghanistan. You probably don't want to keep them in Afghanistan, where they probably have all these people, all these interpreters that are just waiting to get processed and be told yes or no. And so it's,
Pakistan maybe, or
probably not Pakistan, because Pakistan didn't really like us over there. But maybe, and I know we used to go through Manas, which is, I think it's Kyrgyzstan, one of the old former Soviet, it was one of the bases we'd always come through going to Afghanistan was Manas, and then Iraq was Kuwait. You kind of stage in Kuwait and then you go into Iraq. So I imagine it's something like that, although the Russians don't want us there, and I think Kyrgyzstan finally caved and we shut that down. But it's probably something like that. Maybe the old Romania, I think, was the one they were looking at opening after Manas, but that was after my time.
Well, you've been in military all your life. Reflecting on that, how does that affect you?
I think it makes me a lot more independent, and I kind of expect that of the people around me, I think, sometimes more than I probably should. There's a lot of my expectation that if, I'm going to take care of myself, then you should be able to take care of yourself. And
you see that as a lesson from military life type of
and
issue?
I'm glad that it's made me more independent, more self-sufficient, I guess, that I'm able to, I don't want to say that people can't take care of themselves, because they can, but it just seems, whereas you hit a hardship, people just can't see things as it's a temporary problem. It's if I hit a problem, then it just seems like they melt down more easily, and I guess
they don't look for their resources.
Yeah, they just don't you can't take a step back and say, okay, this is the problem, how am I going to fix it, type of thing. It's I got a problem, and it's just like it's beyond me, and I need somebody else to help me fix it, or I just won't fix it. Or whereas I think military people sometimes more have that ability to kind of take a step back and, you know, look at it holistically and then figure out how they're going to attack it.
Interesting. Yeah. What would you like to tell future generations about military, about good, bad, go for it, or how to view it?
Well, just about all my experiences in the Army were good. So if that's something that people are interested in, and I would say go for it. Yeah, absolutely. At least give it you don't have to stay in. It's a volunteer service, so try it out for a couple years. If you don't like it, then you can move on and take those experiences and add that to your resume and go do something else. But I think it'll serve them with whatever they do, because like I said, it'll give them that discipline, that ability to look at problems, and that's basically what it is just problem solving. And it's
in that area.
Yeah. Whatever you do. I mean, it's, as an officer, I was just a manager, really.
Yeah.
I just managed people and resources, and you put something here to solve this shortfall, and then you take a resource from over there, and it's so.
Yeah. Is there anything that we haven't covered that you'd like to say?
I don't think so. Yeah, 20 years, it went by fast. I will say that. You're in, and you're like, oh, I still got so and so more years to retirement, but it goes fast. It went really fast.
Oh.
So,
well, thank you so much. Appreciate that.